The life of a royal guard is one that many admire from afar. People look at these soldiers and see only their uniforms, those perfectly pressed coats, the gleaming helmets, the stiff posture, and they assume that they must be unshakable, unwavering, and even a little distant. They are the strong, silent types who stand tall and still in front of palaces, castles, and important landmarks, guarding the nation's most valuable treasures, its leaders. But few know the struggles and emotions that lie beneath the rigid exterior of these men and women. Samuel was one of those guards, a young man who had always dreamed of serving his country in a meaningful way. From the moment he joined the Royal Guard, he had been trained to stand firm, act with discipline, and to never let his emotions show. The job was simple in one sense: show up, stand guard, protect, and remain unmoved by the distractions around you. But in reality, it was much more complicated than that. There were long shifts, endless hours of standing still, and little time for anything else. The palace where Samuel was stationed stood at the heart of the city, surrounded by beautiful gardens, large stone walls, and tall gates. It was the kind of place that people would stop to admire as they walked by. But for Samuel and the other guards, it was just their workplace. It was their duty to maintain a presence of authority. And while the palace looked majestic and impressive from the outside to the guards, it was simply another place they had to protect, day in and day out. On the morning that Samuel found himself standing outside the gates of the palace for an unusually long shift, the cold seemed to bite through his uniform more sharply than usual. It was the middle of winter, and the sky above him was a dull gray color with thick clouds hanging low. The air was icy, and every breath he took felt like a sharp sting. Even though Samuel had been through the training and was prepared for harsh conditions, it was moments like this, when the cold was so biting and the wind so strong, that made him question if he could keep going. But he had no choice. He had signed up for this job, and he was determined to do it well, no matter how uncomfortable it got. He had stood in that very spot countless times before, his boots firmly planted on the cobblestones, his body locked in the position he had been trained to hold. He never let his eyes wander, never allowed himself to relax, and certainly never showed any signs of weakness. The only thing that broke the silence of his watch were the occasional footsteps of tourists passing by, their eyes wide with curiosity as they gazed up at the guards. They would smile and take photos, marveling at the precision of the guards' movements. But Samuel barely noticed them anymore. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the duty at hand. His thoughts were consumed by the feeling of cold, his stiff limbs, and the monotony of his work. Yet, despite the chill in the air and the exhaustion creeping into his bones, something about that particular morning felt different. There was a sense of stillness that wasn't entirely due to the lack of noise. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something that would break the monotony of the everyday. But nothing changed. Tourists came and went. People took their photos and admired the building. The royal guards remained where they were, unmoving and unblinking. Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. The job required him to remain so detached from the world around him, so distant from the people who walked by. He wasn't allowed to speak, to make eye contact, or to react in any way to the things happening around him. The uniform he wore was meant to act as a barrier, something that separated him from everyone else. It was a reminder that he was not like the rest of the people who enjoyed the warmth of a cozy home, the company of friends and family, or the freedom to laugh and joke. He was here, alone in the cold, standing still for hours on end. As Samuel stood there, his thoughts wandered to his family. He hadn't seen them in weeks. Being a royal guard meant long shifts, often at odd hours, and days would pass without him getting the chance to speak to anyone outside of his fellow guards. His mother had sent him a letter last month, asking when he would be coming home for a visit. He had been so busy with his duties that he hadn't even had the time to write back. His father had been a soldier too, and Samuel remembered how proud his father had been when he had joined the guard. But now, in the solitude of his post, Samuel sometimes wondered if his father ever felt this same sense of loneliness, this sense of being trapped between duty and desire. He shifted slightly, trying to adjust his stance without breaking his position. He could feel the numbness in his fingers and the stiffness in his legs, but there was nothing he could do about it. He couldn't even stretch or wiggle his toes to get the blood flowing again. It was part of the job, the discipline, the focus, the commitment. Samuel had been taught to never let anything get in the way of his duty, and that included his own comfort or well-being. Time seemed to slow down. Hours stretched out and his body ached with the effort of staying still. The people walking by never seemed to notice how difficult it was to stand there for so long, how the cold could seep into your bones and make you question your very resolve. They looked at him and saw only the uniform, the stern face, the impeccable posture. They never saw the tired eyes behind the helmet or the fatigue that weighed on his shoulders. To them, he was just another royal guard, a part of the landscape, a symbol of strength and protection. But Samuel was human, and despite the demands of his role, there were moments when the weight of it all felt too much to bear. He could feel the emotional toll of his job wearing on him, especially on days like this when he felt isolated from the rest of the world. The loneliness wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The constant separation from his family, the lack of personal connection, and the relentless routine of standing guard day after day, all of it began to feel like a heavy burden. Yet, as he stood there, trying to push through the discomfort, he reminded himself why he had taken this job in the first place. It wasn't just about the uniform or the prestige of being a royal guard. It was about serving something bigger than himself, about protecting the monarchy and all that it represented. Even though the job was hard, even though it made him feel disconnected at times, he knew that he was part of something important. And that was what kept him going. That sense of duty, of responsibility, was what he clung to during the toughest moments. For now, Samuel stood firm, as he had been trained to do. He focused on his task, on the purpose that came with his role. But deep down he longed for something more, something that went beyond the uniform and the guard post. Something that reminded him of the humanity he was so often forced to suppress. But that, he knew, was a thought for another time. For now he stood tall, doing what he had been taught to do without question, without complaint. One afternoon, as the pale winter sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden light across the palace grounds, Samuel's shift was beginning to feel especially long. The usual quiet of the palace was almost deafening, the silence broken only by the occasional rustling of the wind and the distant hum of the city beyond the walls. He had been standing for hours in his post, the cold creeping through his uniform, making every muscle in his body ache. He stared straight ahead, barely blinking, keeping his focus on the distant horizon as he had been trained to do. As he stood there, mind wandering to memories of home and the warmth he had left behind, he noticed a small group of tourists approaching the gates. They were bundled up in coats, their faces bright with curiosity as they snapped photos of the palace and the guards standing in formation. Samuel barely paid them any attention at first. Tourists were a common sight. But then his eyes caught something unusual. Among the group was an elderly woman walking slowly with the assistance of a cane. Her face was lined with age, and there was a gentle, kind expression in her eyes. She didn't seem in a hurry like the others, who were busy taking photos and chattering excitedly. Instead, she moved at her own pace, her steps deliberate and steady, her eyes scanning the palace with quiet reverence. Samuel was used to people taking pictures and smiling at him, but this woman, for some reason, stood out to him. There was something different about the way she looked at him, something that made him feel like she wasn't just seeing a guard standing on duty, but a person, a human being standing in front of her. Her gaze was warm, not the usual casual curiosity he saw in most tourists. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Samuel felt something stir within him, a sense of connection, however fleeting. The woman paused in front of him. The crowd moved on, some of them glancing back at her, wondering why she had stopped. But the elderly lady seemed in no rush. She smiled at Samuel, her face softening into a gentle expression that seemed to say more than just a passing greeting. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice frail but clear. "May I ask you something?" Samuel was momentarily caught off guard. He had never been approached like this before. The rules of the guard were clear. No talking, no interaction, no gestures. He was meant to remain silent and unyielding no matter what happened around him. But this woman's voice was so kind, and there was something about her that made it hard to ignore. He wasn't sure how to respond, but after a beat he nodded slightly, as if to acknowledge her presence. "How long have you been standing out here in the cold?" she asked, her gaze now more focused on him than the palace behind him. Samuel hesitated. He didn't want to break his strict code of conduct, but there was something in her question, something in the way she asked it, that made him feel like he could give just a little. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to keep his posture while engaging with her. "It's been a few hours, ma'am," he said, his voice low but polite. The woman nodded, her eyes softening even further. "I can only imagine how cold it must be. I used to have a grandson who was in the military. He'd tell me about the long hours he spent outside in all kinds of weather, and how he never got used to it. But he did it because he believed in something bigger than himself." Samuel listened intently, his mind momentarily drifting to his own family, to the warmth and comfort of his home that seemed so far away at that moment. He didn't know why, but there was something about this woman's words that resonated with him. It was rare to have someone ask him about his experiences, let alone someone who seemed so genuinely concerned. It was strange, but for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt like he was seen, not just as a soldier, but as a person. The woman continued, her voice steady and kind. "You know," she said with a smile, "my husband was a soldier too. He served for many years, and there were times when he was stationed far away, just like you. I used to worry about him, about the cold and the loneliness, but he always told me that it was his duty, his honor to serve. And even though it was hard sometimes, he did it because he believed in the cause." Samuel nodded, absorbing her words. It was clear that this woman had lived a full life, and her words carried the weight of experience. There was a deep understanding in her voice, one that Samuel hadn't expected to hear today. He had always been taught that the job of a guard was to remain detached, to keep emotions at bay, but now, in this moment, the walls he had built up around himself seemed to soften. "I'm sure he was proud of you," Samuel said, finally breaking his own silence. It felt strange to speak like this, but the conversation felt natural, as though they were two people simply talking, not a guard and a tourist. The woman smiled warmly. "Yes, he was. And I'm proud of you too," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I know you have a job to do, and I know it's not always easy. But just remember that what you're doing matters. You're protecting something important, even if you don't always get to see the full picture. It may not always feel rewarding, but what you do means more than you think." For a moment, Samuel was at a loss for words. He had always known that his job was important, but hearing someone say it so directly with such sincerity made him see it in a new light. The weight of the responsibility he carried had always felt heavy, and in many ways it still did. But now, talking to this woman, he felt a sense of validation that he hadn't realized he needed. "Thank you," Samuel finally said, his voice quieter now, filled with gratitude. "You've made me think about things a bit differently." The woman gave him a gentle nod, her smile never fading. "Sometimes we all need a little reminder. You're doing good work, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." With that, she slowly turned and began to walk away, her cane tapping softly against the stone path. Samuel stood there for a moment watching her go. He could still feel the warmth of her words lingering in his mind. It was strange how a brief conversation with a stranger could make him feel more connected to the world beyond his post. As the woman disappeared into the distance, Samuel took a deep breath, feeling a bit lighter. The cold didn't seem quite so unbearable now. The numbness in his limbs wasn't as painful. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. There was a quiet understanding, a small reminder that the people outside the palace, the people he guarded, saw him not just as a symbol of authority, but as a person with thoughts, feelings, and experiences. The shift stretched on, as it always did, but Samuel felt a new sense of resolve. The work he did was important, yes, but it wasn't just about standing still or following orders. It was about the connections we make, even in the most unlikely of places, and the small moments that remind us that we are all human. As the days passed, Samuel began to settle into the rhythm of his role as a royal guard. The long hours, the cold weather, the strict rules, they all became part of his routine. But despite his training, something inside him was beginning to shift. It wasn't just the physical discomfort, which he had learned to endure. It was something deeper, something emotional. Samuel was starting to feel a sense of loneliness that he hadn't expected when he first joined the guard. At the start, he had been proud of his uniform, of the honor that came with being a royal guard. The idea of protecting something as important as the monarchy had given him a sense of purpose. But over time, the endless hours spent alone at his post, the lack of personal connection, and the rigid structure of his job had started to wear him down. One evening after his shift, Samuel found himself sitting on a bench in a small courtyard just behind the palace walls. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the palace grounds, but he didn't feel the comfort of the warmth. He just felt empty. The usual camaraderie he shared with his fellow guards had started to fade. They all kept to themselves, focused only on their duties, never speaking of personal matters. It was as if the uniform they wore was a barrier that separated them from the world, from each other. Samuel had tried to push his feelings aside, focusing only on his job. But lately it was getting harder to ignore them. His family was far away, and though he received letters from them, the words felt distant, like a life he could no longer reach. His mother often wrote about how much she missed him, how his younger sister had grown taller, how his father's health was slowly declining. But Samuel could never find the time to visit them. There was always something more urgent, another shift, another duty to fulfill. One evening, while sitting on the bench, Samuel's thoughts turned to his fellow guard, Robert. Robert had been serving as a royal guard for many years. He was older, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen more than Samuel could imagine. Robert was a man of few words, always focused on the task at hand, but Samuel had noticed that he was often quiet, even when they weren't on duty. The man had an air of sadness around him, a quiet pain that seemed to linger behind his stoic demeanor. It wasn't uncommon for the guards to stick to themselves, but Samuel couldn't help but wonder if Robert was feeling the same isolation that he was. After all, Robert had been doing this job for far longer than Samuel. Surely he must have faced the same feelings of loneliness and disconnection at some point. That evening, when Samuel saw Robert walking toward him, he hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure if he should speak. Guards were not supposed to discuss their feelings, not supposed to show vulnerability, but something about the way Robert moved, his shoulders slightly slumped, made Samuel feel that maybe, just maybe, Robert could understand. "Mind if I sit?" Samuel asked, his voice a little uncertain. Robert gave a brief nod, as if the question didn't need an answer. He sat down beside Samuel, looking out at the palace gardens, his eyes distant, lost in thought. For a while, neither of them said anything. The sounds of the palace seemed far away, and the world around them felt quiet, as if time had stopped. Samuel had never expected to be sitting here like this, talking to another guard about his struggles, but the silence between them felt comfortable, like an unspoken understanding had been established. Samuel could feel his nerves easing. Eventually Robert spoke, his voice low and steady, like he had been holding onto these words for a long time. "It's not always easy, is it?" Robert said, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "The standing, the waiting. It wears on you after a while." Samuel looked at him, surprised by the honesty in Robert's voice. He had always seen Robert as someone who was unshakable, someone who had it all together. The idea that Robert might feel the same way he did seemed almost impossible. "I've been doing this for a long time," Robert continued. "Too long, maybe. But sometimes I wonder what I'm really doing. I mean, I know we're here to protect the monarchy, to serve and keep the palace safe, but sometimes I wonder if it's worth all the things we miss, the things we don't get to experience." Samuel felt a wave of relief wash over him. Robert understood. The weight of the job, the loneliness, the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't just his imagination. Robert had felt it too. "Yeah," Samuel said, his voice quieter now. "It's hard. You feel like you're doing something important, but at the same time it feels like you're not living your own life. It's like you're just stuck." Robert nodded slowly. "I know exactly what you mean. It gets easier to push those feelings away, to bury them deep, but sooner or later they catch up with you." The conversation hung in the air between them, unspoken thoughts shared without the need for many words. Samuel found comfort in the fact that he wasn't alone in his feelings. Robert's honesty gave him a sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He had been carrying his emotions in silence for so long, thinking that no one would understand, that no one else felt the same. But now he realized he was wrong. There were others who shared his struggles, even if they never talked about it openly. They sat in silence for a while longer, both lost in their thoughts. Samuel thought about his family again, how much he missed them and how much he wished he could be with them. He thought about his younger sister, who was probably growing up so fast. He had missed her birthday again this year, just like the year before. He had promised his mother that he would visit soon, but the days just seemed to slip away, one after the other. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Samuel finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, I want to do my job. I want to serve. But sometimes I feel like I'm losing myself in all of it." Robert turned to look at him, his eyes softening. "It's okay to feel that way," he said. "It doesn't make you weak. It just makes you human." Samuel was taken aback by Robert's words. For so long he had been taught to suppress his emotions, to stay strong no matter what. But hearing Robert's perspective made him realize that it was okay to feel vulnerable. It was okay to have doubts. It was okay to long for connection and to want something more than just standing still in front of the palace gates. I guess I just need to find a way to balance it all," Samuel said, his mind racing with the idea. "I need to remember why I'm doing this. But I also need to make space for the things that matter to me. My family, my life outside of this place." Robert gave a small smile, a rare expression that made Samuel feel a little lighter. "You'll figure it out. Just don't forget who you are, even when you're in that uniform. That's the most important thing." For the first time in a long while, Samuel felt a sense of hope. The path ahead might be difficult, but he wasn't alone. He had someone to talk to, someone who understood. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to hold on to his humanity while still honoring the duty he had sworn to protect.